Okay, we will go ahead and officially begin. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our November 2020 meeting for the Naples chapter of the Florida Native Plant Society. My name is Andy Nacarado. I am the chapter president, and I'll be the Zoom host for this meeting. And you can see on the slide here, we'll go over our usual Zoom housekeeping first. And then I'll go through a quick series of important announcements before we begin our feature presentation, which of course tonight is an introduction to pollinator gardening by our chapter's very own Wade Gurley. And I wanted to thank everybody for sticking with us with the last minute rescheduling that we had for this meeting. So I hope everybody and your family and friends, everybody was safe and fared well with the tropical storm last week. When you join the meeting, your cameras and microphones should have been off. So that means that no one else in the meeting will be able to see or hear you, but you will be able to see and hear the meeting and the feature presentation for tonight. So we ask that you do keep your cameras and microphones turned off because we are recording the meeting to post it on our website, and it helps us preserve the quality of the presentation for future viewing. If at any time you have a question, please use the chat feature to type in your question. And after the feature presentation, we will answer as many questions as we have time for. If we run out of time for some reason, you can always email us at naplesnativeplants@fnps.org, and we'll do our best to follow up with your question after the meeting. The meetings, as I said, are recorded. They get posted to our website, which is fnpsnaples.org. And the meetings are posted to our YouTube channel. And I have an exciting update for our YouTube videos. We now have subtitles in 3 languages for our recordings. So you can read subtitles on the meetings in English, Spanish, or Haitian Creole. And those are 3 of the languages that are the most common in our area in Collier County. So very excited to share that update because we're working to increase accessibility of sharing our content about native plants in Collier County. Okay. Now moving through our other announcements, if you were with us for our October meeting, you know that the Naples chapter was endorsing and spreading the word about the Conservation Collier referendum that was on the most recent election. And I'm sure everybody has heard that Conservation Collier's referendum did pass. And that will reestablish funding to purchase and maintain our Collier County preserves, which of course contain our native ecosystems and hundreds, if not thousands, of native plants. There were other local organizations that endorsed the referendum, including the Florida Native Plant Society. And if you voted to help pass this referendum, there's a big thank you coming from us at the Naples chapter, as well as Yes Conservation Collier, who we partnered with to spread the word about the referendum. Next up, I wanted to briefly introduce the nominees for next year's board for the Naples chapter. If you are a member of the Naples chapter, keep an eye out for your December newsletter, and that will contain a link for you to vote online in the board member election, which will officially elect the nominees that I'm going to share with you here. So on the left, that's me. I am nominated next year for president and programs chair, and those are the same 2 roles that I was filling this year. Next, we have Evan Barr, who is nominated for Vice President and Plant Sales Chair, and that will be a new, very exciting position for our chapter. Then on the right, we have Karen Allman, who, if you have been part of the Naples chapter for many years, you probably recognize her name. She has served on the board before, and she is nominated for Secretary and Outreach Chair. then these three individuals were all interested in serving on the board in a collaboratory sort of way. So we have on the left, Becky Troop, who is nominated for co-treasurer. Then in the middle, of course, our featured speaker for tonight, but also board member, Wade Gurley. He is nominated for co-treasurer and co-conservation chair for next year, along with Liberty Gibson, also nominated as co-conservation chair. And that is the role that Liberty had this year, as well as vice president. So I know there's lots of names and positions floating around here, but you're all sticking with it, I know. Last but not least, we have Connie Nagel, who was nominated as our membership chair for next year. If you got your November newsletter, yes, November, there were brief bios that were shared about each of the nominees. So if you want to get to know the different nominees a little bit better, you can refer back to your November newsletter. Or if you didn't get the newsletter, you can send us an email asking to get a copy of the bios, and we'll be happy to do that for you. So we're looking forward to the election of our board members for next year in early December. Since I was highlighting some of our new and future and current leaders for the Naples chapter, I wanted to recognize some other volunteers for our chapter at this time. On the left, we have Kara Driscoll. She has served as chapter representative for the last several years. And the only reason why she's not listed as a nominee is because her position, chapter representative, is an appointed position rather than an elected position. So once the election is completed, then her position will be appointed at that time. And also, if you've been in the Naples chapter for a while, you probably recognize the name Danny Cox. Danny has most recently served as secretary, and he's a past president for the Naples chapter. And moving forward, he's going to volunteer as our YouTube manager, which is becoming more and more important in this day and age with all of the online meetings that we have. And we are excited that Danny will still be volunteering with our chapter. And then a couple of more volunteers on the left, Alicia Schwartz. She volunteers as our Facebook manager, does an excellent job sharing lots of native plant content with our Facebook followers. And then on the right, Michael Troop volunteers many hours updating and upgrading our website and keeping it current. So if you haven't seen our website lately, definitely check it out, fnpsnaples.org. So thank you to everybody, whether you're a volunteer, a board member, a member, or anyone who's a native plant enthusiast. Thank you for spreading the word about native plants and how important they are to our community. Another exciting announcement that I have is for the winner of the Florida Native Plant Month giveaway. October every year is officially designated as Florida Native Plant Month. And this past year, our chapter partnered with Naples Botanical Garden for a couple of exciting prizes for one lucky Naples chapter member. The prizes were a family membership to Naples Botanical Garden and eligibility for a private native plant tour. So all that anyone had to do was be a member of the Naples chapter by the end of October, so by the end of Florida Native Plant Month. And out of all of the Naples chapter members, one member was randomly selected to win the prize, and that winner is John Feiner. And I don't believe John is in the meeting tonight, but I've already been in correspondence with him, and he is very excited to accept his Florida Native Plant Month prize. So keep tuned in until next October when we'll have our next Florida Native Plant Month and more exciting celebrations associated with that. A few more upcoming programs. Our next meeting is just 2 weeks away. I know our schedule was a bit unusual for this month, but Wednesday, December 2nd at 6:30 is our next chapter meeting. We'll be hearing from 2 board members from the Cocoloba chapter, which serves Lee County, just north of us. and that's Tony Moriello and Marlene Rodak, and they'll be telling us about the history and development of their Cutting Horse Eco Center, which is a native plant nursery and display garden that the Cocoloba chapter maintains. And that following Saturday, December 5th, we're invited to drop in at the Cutting Horse Eco Center to see it for ourselves. And we can drop in anytime during their opening hours between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. There's no RSVP required. But note that social distancing will be required, face masks optional. And there's more details about that field trip in the newsletter as well. Just a couple more, I promise. This Wednesday, the 18th at 7:30, the Naples chapter is having its bi-monthly board meeting. During the board meetings, we cover chapter business only, so we do not have a guest speaker and an educational presentation like we do tonight in our public meetings. But if you are interested in observing the board meeting, feel free to send us an email at the address shown on the screen, and we'll send you the link to observe the board meeting. And finally, on Monday, November 30th, Conservation Collier is seeking 10 to 15 volunteers to help with trail beautification at the Otter Mound Preserve on Marco Island. If you are interested in volunteering on that day, starting at 8:30 a.m., please RSVP to Mitchell Berezowski with Conservation Collier at his email or phone number shown on the screen. And they're seeking RSVPs by November 25th. If you have any more questions about this volunteer opportunity, you can email our chapter as well. Finally, lots of announcements tonight, I know, but here we are at the feature presentation, an introduction to pollinator gardening by our very own Wade Gurley, a local biologist and Naples chapter board member. So I am going to turn it over to Wade. I'll stop sharing my screen so Wade can share his presentation.
Thanks, Sandy. Hello, everyone. Again, just want to say thank you for sticking with us and rescheduling a couple times so you could listen and hear what we have to share tonight. Okay, can you hear me and is it showing up, Andy? Good deal. Awesome. So just as a way to introduce myself, I am Wade Gurley, current treasurer and membership chair for the Naples Native Plant Society. I'm currently working as a biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, working with private landowners. So my job is to private landowners, nonprofits, city governments, whoever, I work to help them conserve land and endangered and threatened species. I have been here since 2010. I moved here to work on an internship in 2010, and it kind of just turned into job after job, and I've loved it. So except for about a year and a half when I went to work for National Park Service in Arizona, I've been working in this area, so I know it pretty well. But while I was in Arizona, one of the main projects that I worked on was this big habitat restoration project in this river through this desert habitat. So it's pretty special in that it was a source of a constant source of water in this desert habitat. So it made it pretty interesting. And one of the things that we were learning to do was to reintroduce pollinators in that desert ecosystem. So it's pretty interesting. And in that effect, I went to this really awesome training, which to date has been one of the best trainings that I've ever had in my career. So I just kind of wanted to share the gist of what I've learned with the group tonight. So I will be talking about Introduction to Pollinator Gardening. I did kind of design this as an introduction, so it's very, very beginner level. It's not going to get too in depth, I think. So I'm not going to be able to answer super specific questions, but kind of give you a broad general outline of what to do if you want to design a pollinator garden. So the agenda for tonight, I'm just going to talk about pollination ecology a little bit, what are pollinators, why they're important, why they're in a state of decline like they are in the world currently, things that we can do as individuals and concerned citizens to help their plight. The main thing is by building pollinator gardens. So I'm going to talk about garden design, and then kind of end the presentation with a couple of take-home messages, things that we can do, citizen science projects, and steps that we can take to promote good pollinator ecology practices. So just to start out with, pollination ecology. Why are pollinators important? So 75 to 90% of the flowering plants in the whole world rely on animal pollination for reproduction. 75% of the crops that we use for food, fiber, beverages, condiments, spices, and medicine require pollination. And a lot of these are direct benefits. These pollinators, whether they be bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, bats, are directly pollinating the crops that we're eating. It's pretty important too to think about the secondary effects as well. So bees, for instance, they're going to make honey, as we see in the picture below. If bees disappeared, we wouldn't have honey anymore. But you also have to think of secondary effects. So a lot of livestock, actually the food and the grains and hay that they're fed are actually pollinated by insects as well. So you're not thinking about just direct benefits of what these pollinators are doing for our food source, but what they're doing for the food that we feed the animals that we eat, for those of us who are carnivores. So again, just important to think about direct and secondary benefits that pollinators play in our lifestyle. Honeybees alone contribute up to $5 billion annually to agricultural productivity, and the global environmental services provided by bees are estimated to be around $200 billion. So that's a very significant amount of, if you think of things in terms of money, a very significant monetary benefit of having pollinators. And then some of the specific food items that we all know and love that are pollinator driven: coffee, and my two favorite, chocolate, and the byproduct of fermented grapes, wine. So things to think about, why pollinators are important to each of us. Types of pollinators. There are over 200,000 different species of animals that act as pollinators worldwide. When people think of pollinators, we all tend to think of the cute fuzzy things, hummingbirds, bats. They are very important pollinators in the ecosystem, but over 99.5% of pollinator species are invertebrates. So all the bugs, snails, ants, moths, butterflies, bees, beetles, so many different things actually serve as pollinators. So kind of important to think, in terms of everything that's out there that's providing service for us. Focusing more specifically on bees, bees are pretty much the superstar of the pollinator world. They do a lot of the heavy lifting. A lot of pollination occurs thanks to bees. There are more than 20,000 bee species worldwide. In the United States, there's 4,000 bee species. And then specific to Florida, there's 300 species that can be found here. And of those 300 species, 29 are endemic, which means they're only found in Florida. A little bit of knowledge about bees that a lot of people don't realize. The vast majority of bee species are solitary nesting. So when people think of bees, a lot of people think of these big bee colonies, beehives, such as honeybees or bumblebees, but those are kind of the exception to the rule. The vast majority of bees are going to nest on the ground by themselves or in dead trees and logs and holes in wood and other places. So kind of interesting to think about, that negative stereotype that bees have of being aggressive and forming these annoying colonies. That's not the majority of bee species. So in the bottom two pictures here, I think it's pretty interesting. There's two different Florida bee species that you could see when you're out hiking around. They tend to not be as aggressive as their colony and more social counterparts. But the bee that's on the white flower below, this is a leafcutter bee. And then the green iridescent bee here on the purple flower, that's a sweat bee. And I just think it's really interesting that you can go out hiking and find, this shiny green bee flying around. And a lot of people don't realize that that is a native bee. It's supposed to be here. And it does provide a really great service for us as in addition to being super cool to look at. So the other species that most people think about when they think about pollinators are butterflies. So I just kind of lumped moths and butterflies together because they have such a they're very similar in their life cycle. Worldwide, moths do tend to outnumber butterfly species by a large margin. Within the US, there's 11,000 different moth species and 750 butterfly species. And then within Florida, those numbers are a little closer together, 350 different species of moth and over 200 butterfly species that can be found here in Florida. And for both of these types of insects, it is important to think about, they all have 4 different life stages that they go through: egg, larva, pupa, and adult. So when you are designing pollinator gardens or thinking about a habitat conservation project, you want to make sure that all 4 stages of those are considered when you're thinking about what type of plants to put on the landscape and what type of design for your garden you want to incorporate, just because there are different things that you need to do for the different life stages of those species. So the bad news, pollinator numbers are declining the world over. Bees are specifically noticeably taking a big hit. There's a lot of different reasons why pollinators are in decline. Some of the main ones I'm going to list here and talk about a little bit are habitat loss and fragmentation. So habitat loss, it's pretty self-explanatory. That's where patches of native wildflowers, patches of native land is being developed for whatever reason, residential, commercial. They're building roads. They're being fragmentation is where habitats are being divided up and split into smaller segments that may not be connected. Competition with exotic and introduced species. That might be introduced species of other insects. It could be introduced species of plants that take over and dominate the landscape and exclude those native plants that those pollinators depend on. Pests and pathogens. I think this is one of the main reasons for that they think might be reason for some of the colony collapse disorder within bees. A lot of bees are susceptible to an exotic mite that they found in colonies as well. So those pests and pathogens, there are native ones, but there's also exotic ones that come in with honeybees that are brought over for whatever reason. Exposure to pesticides and agrochemicals is another reason that decline is considered, and reduced floral diversity. So just people planting monocultures in areas, people not having enough plants that are out there. A lot of different reasons why pollinators are going into decline. And so kind of looking at these reasons, I'm going to touch on a lot of these topics later on and what we can do about them within our gardens, but also within society at large, things that we can try to think about and do to help with this decline. But kind of the biggest thing and where pollinator gardens come in handy is the loss of habitat and fragmentation. So one thing that's really interesting about pollinator gardens is that you don't have to have this big, gigantic acreage of land to restore. You can plant pollinator gardens in your backyard, in your front yard, and there's a lot of different options for planting small scale gardens that actually can provide a lot of benefit and kind of help with a lot of decline. And for urban dwelling people and for urban wildlife biologists, it's pretty interesting too, because that's a really big impact that you can have in cities and towns that maybe you can't have as dramatic of an impact out in these bigger restoration areas. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about when you're thinking about pollinator gardens. So once you have decided to build a garden, there are a couple of considerations that you want to think about with the design. The purpose of your garden. There's a lot of considerations. If you do live in town and you have an HOA, you might be restricted to what kind of plants you can plant in your yard. You might have to have a lawn in the front yard. You have to plant your pollinator garden in the backyard. If you do plant a garden, you need to think about the aesthetics of it. Do you want this to be purely for looks, or how much functionality do you want? Do you want to go full 100% in and have just a garden for the purpose of reintroducing pollinators? So you kind of have to gauge your level of dedication and commitment to the project before you design it. That being said, you can provide functionality and benefits to pollinators with any and all of those, any of those designs. So whatever purpose you have and can do within your area, you can benefit pollinators with it. Species composition, this is incredibly important. I'm going to spend probably the most time talking about all the different species compositions that you're going to want to think about when you're considering. So some of the probably the biggest one offhand are what species you want to put in your garden and why. Annual versus perennial. Perennials do tend to be better for pollinators because they, in general, tend to be better sources of nectar than annuals. Also, once perennials are established, that's a dependable source of nectar, food, shelter, whatever they're providing year to year for those pollinators. So you don't have to worry, they don't have to worry about finding that same source because it's going to dependably be there from year to year. You want to also think about the maintenance requirements of your garden. If you're planting a big garden that requires a lot of water or mulching or reseeding, if you want to maintain that, you have to think about the time commitment that you have and the resources you have available to maintaining that garden if you do plant it and create it. Urban versus wildland, I've talked about this a little bit. No garden is too small to plant. No conservation project is too large to think about pollinators. So, this is just something, how much land you have is going to determine what all you can do with it. So that's going to go into your consideration for your design and how much is going to be pollinator garden versus native prairie, and so it's kind of, you have to think about how much of what you want to work with is going to be pollinator based and how much is going to be for the different reasons you might be building your garden. And another important one is the source of plant materials that you're going to use for planting and seeding your garden. If you're going to go from seed, you want to use, reliable sources of seed that are dependable. But more the point that I want to make with this topic is thinking about if you're using actual plants that you're planting, you want to think about where they're grown and what they've been treated with. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about later is specific pesticides and insecticides that are systemic. So a lot of big market, big distributor places where you buy plants, Walmart, Home Depot, Lowe's, places like that, garden centers, they do treat their plants with insecticides and pesticides. And if they use certain ones, those can be systemic. So what that means is that insecticide goes into the plant, it's absorbed in there, it's going to be present in the roots, the leaves, the nectar, the pollen, it's going to be there systemically for up to sometimes the whole lifetime of the plant. So if you plant that plant out in the wild, any insect that feeds on that nectar or feeds on that leaf is going to be impacted by that insecticide. So one good thing I have noticed is that a lot of those places have started putting labels on their plant that tell you that it's not treated with systemic insecticides. So just when you're sourcing your plants, you kind of that's something to be aware of and think about and keep an eye on when you are using those bigger garden distribution centers. So pollinator friendly practices. I'll be going over a lot of these a little more in depth further on, but just kind of want to hit on a couple of them, hit on them to outline them. Foraging habitat. So you always want to have forage available for the pollinators, whether that's going to be the flowers that are producing nectar for the butterflies, it's going to be the plants that produce pollen for the bees, it's going to be just something that they're going to be able to feed on and sustain themselves and their offspring. Reproduction, you need places for these animals to reproduce, you need all of the components that they need for reproduction. Reproduction and shelter kind of go hand in hand. Shelter is going to be available for reproduction, for the laying of eggs, for the building of cocoons for metamorphosis, whatever for the butterflies. So a lot of these things you want to have available for these for the pollinators. You want to think about invasive versus exotic plant species. Natives are always going to be better for choosing plant species as opposed to invasives. But invasive exotic plant species may crowd out and overtake a garden so that there's not going to be these native plants available. They could also not serve the same function or purpose as the natives, so the pollinators may lose that shelter, they may use that forage opportunity that was taken away by those exotic plants. Chemical use and monitoring, those are two things I'm going to touch on later, but you just want to always be mindful of the types of chemicals that you're using, and monitoring is really important just to know how successful your garden's doing. So kind of getting into the main part of the topics that I want to touch on, species composition when you're designing your garden. This is very important for a number of reasons. So species composition is just talking about the types of flowers that you're going to be planting and choosing for your garden. So you want to choose flowers that show a great diversity of shape and color. So flower color and shape is pretty important for a couple of different reasons. One of those is the flower shape can determine accessibility for some of the pollinators. So if you follow my mouse on the screen, you look at this daisy here. Daisies and a lot of the aster plants tend to have these big, wide, kind of fatter flowers. So that's really important for a bumblebee or a bee that's flying around. It gives them a place that they can actually rest on that flower and access the pollen or nectar that they're going to be feeding on without having to worry about hovering and flying and using up all their energy to feed on that flower. So if you compare that to a pea flower, like this purple one here, a bee is not going to be able to necessarily land on this petal because it may not support the weight of that bee. So the bee is going to have a lot of trouble accessing the inside and actually getting to the pollen and nectar of that flower. So flower shape is pretty important for that reason. Some of the flowers actually have evolved those specific shapes for a specific pollinator. So if you think about certain moths that have really long tongues, they evolved to feed on these flowers with these really long, narrow tube necks. So they're going to be feeding on these flowers as opposed to these big, wide open flowers. Or this flower is going to specifically need that one certain moth to feed on it because a bumblebee is not going to be able to get in there and do the job. So just think about the shapes of flowers when you're designing when you're choosing what type of flowers you want to have in your garden. Flower color is also super important as well. Bees are generally more attracted to white, purple, and yellow flowers as opposed to red flowers. They actually have a lot of trouble differentiating between red and green colors. And opposite of that, butterflies and hummingbirds tend to be drawn more to red and purples than the other colors. Not saying that they won't use the other ones, but that's just in general, they are drawn more to reds, and bees are drawn more to white, purple, and yellow flowers. So this continuity of bloom is a really important concept to think about. So thinking about, the life cycle of the local pollinators that you have in your area. So for us in South Florida, we tend to have a longer blooming season of flowers, a longer breeding season because it's warmer here year round. So you want to have flowers that are available of different shapes and colors for more of the time during the year. So I know that this graph down below is blurry and you can't actually read what's written, but I thought this was a really important concept that I wanted to introduce. I've seen it in a couple of places, and I thought that it was a really handy tool to use when you're designing gardens or doing a conservation project. So on the left over here, we just have the list of the flower, different plant names. Across the top, we have kind of a calendar graph set out. This represents the blooming season for wherever this graph was taken. I think it was Vermont. And then below, just for each of the flowers and within the different ranges of the year where they bloom, they've got the color and the duration of the bloom of that particular flower. So this is super handy if you're trying to design a garden. You can actually go in here and look and say, for June, we've got a lot of purple flowers, but we have no yellow flowers. So we need to try and find a native flower that's yellow that blooms in June, and then we can supplement our garden that way. Likewise, you can look and say, the month of August is pretty good, or, you can use this in a couple of different ways on a couple of different axes to look and see what flowers are working best for you during the certain times of year. So that's pretty handy. And actually, Andy, if you want to share, if you haven't already, I sent you a link earlier. There is a list of Florida-specific flowers that I've found that kind of had a lot of this information already laid out. So I thought for those of you who are looking for specifics for this area, you might be able to use that link that Andy's going to share right now. In general, just kind of want to talk about, again, reiterate that perennials generally provide more nectar for a longer period of time than annuals, and they are a more dependable source for multiple years. So I just want to reiterate the importance of perennials versus annuals. Not that annuals can't be used or shouldn't be used, but in general, perennials are going to serve you better for the purpose of enhancing pollinator species. So also want to talk about planning for life cycle, all the different life stages of butterflies and moths. You want to choose species that provide nectar for the adult life stages and serve as host species for the larval stages. So again, you want the flowers to be available for the adults to nectar on, and then you want the plants to be there for the larval host, the caterpillars, to be able to eat. So it is important that if you do plant a garden and you see all the leaves of certain plants disappearing, that's actually a good sign. That means that those caterpillars are doing what they're supposed to do. They're eating the plants and using that energy to turn into the butterflies that are going to pollinate other plant species. So you pretty much kind of want to think about that. You're planting species for the purpose of them being eaten by the caterpillars. And then kind of thinking about these intermediary stages, the eggs and the pupa stages of these insects, you know, they need to have structure and shelter for the eggs to be protected from the elements and to be protected from predators for eggs and the cocoons of these species, so that birds and other insects aren't coming along and eating them. So when you're designing your garden, you want to think about having not just flowers, but grasses, woody plants, and other thicker, more dense vegetation around that the eggs and stuff can be laid on. So getting deeper into that, I just want to talk about woody plants and grasses. They are a very important component of pollinator gardens. Maybe less easy to plant, like in your front yard, having a big woody, huge species, but if in your backyard, the edges of your property, especially in more less urban areas, you can think about planting more bigger bunchy grasses and woody plants. But they do play an important role, so I thought it was worth mentioning. They provide shelter, shade, and foraging and larval host opportunities for a lot of different species. So just the pictures here on this PowerPoint, you can actually see a spice bush up here on the top. This is a really great native to use. It provides nectar for a lot of different butterfly species and as a larval host for a couple of caterpillars. Wild coffee is another great woody species to plant. And then there's actually a couple of grasses that I thought were worth mentioning. The grass here is pink muley, or muley grass. It's really great for a lot of native species. It provides great cover and it's really attractive. It's got this beautiful pinkish purple showy top that sees out. So a lot of people actually do use this. I've seen it in a lot of highway medians around town and driving up 75. There were a couple of other grass species that I wanted to mention. Broom sedge bluestem, Takahatchee grass, and lopsided Indian grass. These are other grasses that actually serve as larval host species for multiple different skipper and butterfly species. So those are great grasses to think about if you're thinking about grasses to use in your garden or around your house, around your property. When I talk about natives, exotics, near natives, cultivars, nativars, there's a lot of terms to throw in there. But when you're thinking about the different species to use, so many different studies that I saw when I was researching pollinator gardens and pollinator habitats talk about the importance of using native species in these gardens. Many different studies showed that gardens with a higher proportion of native flora exhibited elevated pollinator activity. They saw more pollinators, a more diverse number of pollinators, and greater activity of those pollinators around those gardens with more natives. That's because those native plants are better adapted to local soils and climates, and the native pollinators are better adapted. They've co-evolved with those native plants and those blooming phenologies. So many different reasons to choose native plants versus exotics. And I just kind of want to take this moment to point out that exotics aren't always bad. That's not a bad term. I just want to say that they should be used supplementally and in moderation. So if for some reason you've got a particular pollinator that you're wanting to increase the numbers of, and they have a specific host plant that you have trouble finding, or that host plant itself is rare, and you know that there's an exotic that could be useful in supplementing that, totally by all means bring that in and plant it. You just always kind of want to be aware of the fact, especially if you're in more conservation-minded areas, that exotic species do tend to like escape from captivity. They can become a big problem and actually outcompete those native plants. So that's one reason, one of the many reasons why we kind of stress not using exotic species as opposed to natives. Near natives, so if you find that there's a plant that you want to use or need to use that's not found within the range, it's always better to go closer rather than further to find those supplemental exotic species. So near native is just a term that I've used and heard used before for plants that are found. An example would be a plant that's found in Central Florida, but not South Florida, but you know that it can be grown here and that it can actually do well for the local pollinators. So something like that would probably be more ideal to use than something that you're bringing in from Europe or Asia or some place that's further away. So the closer the better, closer to home the better if you're going to use something that's not totally native. And then cultivars and nativars are just terms that are used for plants that have been, that could occur locally, natively, but they've had some sort of, they've been modified through breeding or genetics to actually not resemble their native plant, their native structure. So an example would be a daisy that's natively and naturally found to have white flowers that's been bred in captivity to have purple flowers. By all means, it's probably got the same functionality and biology of that native plant, but the local pollinators might not know that that's the flower they're supposed to be looking for. They may be out there looking for a white flower, and then they don't know that this purple flower can provide the same function. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're planting gardens and deciding what plants you're going to use for your restoration projects. So now then, kind of moving on to the layout of your gardens. In general, you want to clump species rather than having them scattered out. In smaller spaces, this maybe doesn't have as big of an impact, but the bigger your garden gets, you kind of want to take this into account. Some studies have shown that bee species, particularly when they go out on foraging trips, they actually like to make single species foraging trips. So they'll go to different flowers of the same species on one trip, bring all that pollen back to their nest or their hive or their colony, whatever it is, deposit that, and then go out. They may go to a different species, but in general, they do tend to like to go to species of the same, flowers of the same species in one trip. So that if those flowers are clumped together, it makes their job a lot easier. They're expending less energy trying to fly around your whole garden looking for another flower of that same species or same color or same shape, whatever cue they're using to cue in on. Also, clumping actually can help, especially in larger ecosystems. If you've got a highly mobile species but a really large area, if you clump the species together, they're going to be able to find a group of needles in a haystack as opposed to one. So if those flowers are all there, whether it be scent or color or shape, whatever signal they're giving to the pollinators, that's going to be more easily identified if they're clumped together than if they're looking through a big, dense cover of a bunch of different plants. So when laying out your garden, you kind of want to clump rather than scatter. You always want to provide a water source. Here in South Florida, that's maybe a little less important to think about than other more dry areas, but especially for nesting and foraging species that may not be as mobile as hummingbirds, bats, or some of the bigger insects, they need a source of water where they can drink. So I know that especially in urban areas, you want to think about not providing habitat for mosquitoes to lay their eggs in. So a lot of times the morning dew is enough for a lot of insects, but just kind of something to be mindful about if you are providing these gardens, and in drier times of the year, you may put out little pots of water or make sure that there's streams or puddles or something nearby that pollinators can drink from. And I want to talk a little bit about bare ground and why it's important. So as in this really cute picture of this bee that's on the bottom here, a lot of bees and insects do nest and build their homes in the ground. So bare ground is important. So they actually have access to build their nests in and build their shelters in. So mulching can actually inhibit the access to ground pollinators. So it's just kind of, I'm not saying don't mulch, but it is important to think about, you don't want to 100% mulch your pollinator garden, because you're not going to give those pollinators access to bare ground if they're seeking that as a shelter or ground nesting opportunity. Also, mulching can actually inhibit the growth of seeds of a lot of native plants. So especially those perennials that you planted, and you want to know that they're going to come back year to year. If they're self-seeding, those seeds are going to fall to the ground. You've got a thick layer of mulch. Those seeds aren't going to be able to reach the ground and regrow and resprout themselves. So a couple of considerations to think about with bare ground and what the important role that it plays for the different pollinators. So I'm going to talk a little bit about garden enhancements, things that you can do after you've got your garden in place. So you can provide bee houses. The picture over here on the top is actually an example of what I mean by bee houses. So it's just a collection of different size bores and different sizes of wood. So again, so many different species of bees actually are wood or ground nesters. What this does is it provides homes of different diameters, shapes, and selection for all these different species of bees and insects that might be looking for pieces of wood or ground to nest in. So these are really simple to make yourself. I think you can get them online pretty cheap. So they're really nice and simple addition to any pollinator garden. It's going to provide shelter, habitat, reproduction, overwintering opportunities for a lot of different species. One thing to think about when enhancing your garden is connectivity of shelter and foraging habitats. So again, those larger species, butterflies, hummingbirds, they're highly mobile. They can travel from place to place super easily. But once you start thinking about the insects that don't fly, that have to crawl around or jump or whatever from plant to plant, you want to make sure that their shelter and their foraging opportunities and their water, they have all those kind of close together. So you want connectivity between those sources. You want to make sure that they can get from their home to their food to their water, all within a pretty close range of each other. You want to make sure those are connected. There's not a big driveway or road or something blocking access to all those different things. Another important aspect to think about are leaving dead plants in place and leaf litter. Those are beneficial. They provide cover, shelter, nesting sites, and food opportunities sometimes to a lot of different insects. So leaving those in place, as much as possible. Again, if you're dealing with HOA regulations or you're trying to maintain your yard, you may not want to do that. So a lot of these are just enhancements. They're not requirements, but they will, a lot of times if you do these activities, you will see an increase in pollinator activity. Also leaving out salt blocks or wood ash, that's another opportunity to provide minerals to a lot of these species. It's kind of the daily vitamin that we take as humans. It's just something extra for them that they can get extra nutrition that they might not be getting from their foraging. And then lawn enhancements. So again, going back to, for those of us who have HOA requirements or you're trying to maintain a lawn, there's a lot of different things that you can actually do for lawns that enhance their benefit to pollinators. So Andy provided me this great picture, and I actually forgot to credit you on this one, but I'm just going to mention a couple of different species that you could seed in your own lawn that are actually they're native, they're beneficial to pollinators. They can be mowed, you can walk on them, and they tend to come back and be super hardy plants, but you can actually put them in your yard, mow them, treat them like grass, and they're going to provide multiple benefits for you and for your yard and for the pollinators. So the one that's pictured here is actually called turkey tangled fog fruit. It's a native, and I think this is a buckeye skipper that is feeding on this small little flower. There's a lot of different species of native clovers that are super helpful. This is another example too where supplementing with exotic species, if it's going to be in a yard that it's not going to escape out into the wild somewhere, or if it's a species that really can't compete to taller grasses, it's going to do well in a yard but not in the wild, this is a good place to put like white clover or some native clover species. Also, sunshine mimosa is another species that is native, local, and can be grown in yard and is beneficial to to pollinators. And they all have really cool, this fog fruit has a really cool flower. It kind of has a cool white and purple flower. The sunshine mimosa has a cool little pink puff that pops up. So they're nice little pretty additions to any yard, and they also help butterflies and other pollinator species. So just something to think about. So now I want to kind of switch gears and talk about chemical use as much as possible, and especially if you are designing a garden that is designed 100% supposed to be functional for pollinators. You want to eliminate insecticides and pesticides as much as possible, and totally if you're out in a more conservation rural area, you don't want to use these to treat the plants. But if you are in a more urban area, there's a lot of different timing and methods of application, differences that you can do with your timing and method of application to reduce the impacts on pollinators. Some of those include focused application. So instead of broadcasting a chemical across your whole yard or across your whole garden, just treat the areas that need it. Treat the specific plants that are having problems. More focused application is going to lessen the impact that it has on other pollinator species or other insect species. As much as possible, if you are going to use chemicals, try to use them in the evening or at nighttime. That's just when most pollinators are going to be less active. Most pollinators are going to be active in the morning or during the day. So by spraying chemicals in the nighttime or in the late evening, you're going to reduce the chances of direct impact with those pollinators. And except for moths and not the few nocturnal pollinators that we have, it's going to give those chemicals a chance to be absorbed by the plant to dry and reduce the impact on the more numerous pollinators that are going to be active during the day the next day. And you always want to pay attention to active ingredients in the chemicals that you use. So again, if you're trying to be mindful of pollinators, you always want to avoid these what are called neonicotinoids. They're the systemic pesticides that are used. I've seen a couple of different studies that actually say some bee species are not negatively impacted and then other ones are. So from what I've seen from a lot of the conservation organizations, they say just avoid neonicotinoids altogether. And then just kind of keep yourself abreast of the news coming out about different active ingredients and pesticides and insecticides, just so you know what are being championed by conservation organizations, ones they say to avoid. So just kind of better educate yourself on the ingredients that are better to use versus those that are not. And then last but not least, I definitely want to talk about the importance of monitoring. So it's just important once you do design a garden. Most of us are pretty, especially since you're here, I assume you're interested in gardening or insects or pollinators. So it's just fun to go out and see what you've planted, what it's doing. So kind of go out, keep track of the number of bees that you're seeing, the kinds of butterflies that are showing up in your yard. It lets you know, for one, if those bees or butterflies are in decline, maybe you need to plant more flowers. Maybe you need to talk your neighbor into planting some flowers so that there's more there for them. It could be that you're just not planting the right plants. Maybe you are seeing butterflies and bees flying around, but they're in your neighbor's yard, not yours. So it kind of gives you an idea of how your garden's doing. You can make those changes if necessary. But it's also really important, and what I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation talking about is citizen science. So monitoring kind of gives you an idea of what you're doing locally, but you can use that to inform scientists and scientific organizations at large, to let them know what's going on more local scale conservation efforts. So for monitoring, I've listed here a couple of different websites and one organization, the North American Butterfly Monitoring Network. I think it's great to check all these out. And I think most of them have apps that you can actually download on your phone. So the premise of a lot of these is you just pay attention to what you're seeing when you're out on a walk, out in your yard, in your local pollinator garden. You take a picture and you send it to this organization and you say, hey, I just saw a monarch butterfly. I just saw this really cool iridescent green beetle. you take a picture of it. You don't even have to take a picture of it. Some of them you can just, if you know what you saw, you can say what you saw. You can ask questions and they will help you identify the species that you saw. But that just informs them of what is being seen locally, where it's seen, when it's being seen. So they have a better idea of nationwide, statewide, nationwide, what is being seen, when and where. It's also just great for yourself too, because you can educate yourself, teach yourself more, teach your friends the names of different butterflies and insects that you are seeing. E-butterfly is really good, iNaturalist. You can actually post a picture and have a local expert respond and say, this is what you just took a picture of. So you can find out what you're seeing in your yard. Bug Guide is one that I actually use a lot to find out if I see bug species. And there's a really interesting story that I actually heard over the weekend. There was somebody in Miami took a picture of a weird bug that they found. I don't know if it was in their yard, in their garden, or on a hike somewhere, but they took a picture of it, sent it to Bug Guide, and a local bug expert actually responded and said, this is an exotic bug species that we've never recorded in Florida before. So by this citizen science project, by somebody taking a picture and sending it to Bug Guide, they actually had an early detection of this potato beetle or potato weevil, whatever it was that they found. So kind of conservation in action, and a cool story of the things that can come from just, taking pictures and sending them to strangers on the internet. And talking about advocacy, that's another very important part of what we do. So obviously you're familiar with the Native Plant Society since you're in a meeting. But when I talk about advocacy, that's just, becoming involved in different community organizations, different scientific organizations around, talking to your friends and your neighbors about why pollinators are important, why native plants are important. It's easy to network and meet like-minded people, but you also help get the word out about the importance of these different topics that we all are passionate about. So kind of a list of those different societies that I know locally and nationally. Florida Native Plant Society is a great place, obviously. The Xerces Society, that's a national organization. I think it's based in Portland, Oregon, but they do work nationwide, focused particularly on insects and pollinator species conservation. So you can go to their website and learn a lot. They have a lot of citizen science listed on there. They have a lot of resources that you can use for educational purposes. So a lot of neat stuff on their program. Master Gardener programs, Master Naturalist programs. They're two great programs that I've seen local chapters of. So you can become involved in those to become better gardeners, become better naturalists. It's also great places to network and meet other people that are passionate about the same things. Also, the University of Florida Insect Effect. I think that's a new program, that joint program that Naples Native Plant or the Native Plant Society at a state level has been promoting. So I think, Andy, you maybe have a link to share in the chat for that. But if you click on that link, it'll take you to their website. They've got a pretty quick, interesting video that you can watch, and kind of talks about the importance that insects play in the native ecosystem. And then again, just talking to friends and family, neighbors, just about the different, what you learned here tonight, what you're going to learn in the future, the importance of what that native plants play, that pollinators play in our world overall. And then taking that a step further, talking to local parks, your local government, your churches, cemeteries. These are all places, and there's probably more examples that I don't have listed here. Places that actually have golf courses. Golf courses are another one that just popped into my mind. Talk to them about the ability to plant native plants, to plant pollinator gardens on their landscape. These are all places that usually have, some sort of gardening or horticultural display on their property. And so if you are a member of these or just want to advocate to your local group about this, definitely think about reaching out to them. And we've actually got we've got members of our board that have done this before with local parks. And so if you are interested in attempting that or reaching out or getting more information, definitely email us at the Naples Native Plant Chapter, and we'll be able to work with you if you have ideas or just want help thinking about ideas or how to start that step. And so I think that is everything that I have for tonight. Just wanted to hit back on a couple of things in summary. So probably the most important thing about designing a pollinator garden is diversity. Diversity of species, of flower shape, of flower color, of structure, I didn't mention it before, of just height of the plants. You want short plants, you want tall plants, you want thick bushy plants, you want little scraggly plants, vines, as much as possible. If you're designing a garden, you want as much different diversity of as much different types as possible in there. Natives are always best, but if you do use exotics, use them supplementally. Avoid neonicotinoids, and as much as possible, advocate and educate for pollinators and for native plants. And I think with that, I will be happy to answer any questions. This is my work email, so please feel free to email me at work if you have any questions about this or conservation on private lands. And you can also email us at naplesnativeplants@fnps.org. We will be happy to field any questions.
Thank you so much, Wade. Excellent, very informative and thorough presentation. So I'm sure everybody appreciates that. There were a couple of things that came to mind for me that I'd like to share. Remember, if you have any questions for Wade, please put them in the chat. Or if you do not have access to the chat feature, you could unmute yourself to ask a question. So I have a feeling that Wade has convinced everyone to use mostly native plants in their pollinator gardens, if you weren't already convinced. And you might be wondering, where is the best place to get native plants that's close by? One of the closest places for us in Collier County is actually the Cutting Horse Eco Center, the Cocoloba chapter's native plant nursery that's in Bonita Springs. And I wanted to mention that if you're not able to make it on that Saturday, December 5th, that we're having our casual drop-in field trip, that's okay. They are open to the public every Saturday between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. So that's something to keep in mind. And also, it never hurts to ask for specific native plants at whatever your plant nursery of choice is. Even if it's not specifically a native plant nursery, it doesn't hurt to ask for certain native plants that you're looking for, because we all know that how supply and demand works. The more people that ask for a certain plant, the more likely that nursery will choose to carry the plant. So those are a couple of insights that came to mind for me. And let's see, so far, I am not seeing anything in the chat for me. Are you seeing anything that went directly to you, Wade?
Let me stop sharing my screen. No. Everybody's going to sleep.
I doubt that's it. We have a compliment, great presentation, very comprehensive. That came from Amber.
Thank you.
And if anybody wants to unmute themselves at this time to ask a question, you may do that. We have another thank you from Beth, saying the presentation was very informative.
Thank you, Beth.
I have a question. This is Amber, and I'm just kind of curious about the experience in Arizona versus Florida. It sounds like the principles are very much similar in terms of how to develop a pollinator garden or what you should consider about pollinators. But I'm just curious if there are any differences between the two very different geographic locations. It's out of curiosity.
Definitely a lot of differences. Again, we're following the same guidelines. So it was choosing the specific plants that were native to there. I think the biggest difference there was just we didn't really have a lot of the seed sources we sourced ourselves. So we had to collect the seeds from native plants and then grow them in greenhouse, then go out and plant them. And a lot of that we were kind of learning because since this area was so kind of unique with the river running through the desert habitat, not a lot of people were working in similar situations in conservation land. So a lot of the stuff that we were growing, we were trying to have to figure out ourselves how to grow, as opposed to here, it's more subtropical, so you can just kind of go out in the grass and throw some seeds out, and it's gonna grow. So there it was very much more seasonal. We had to plant in the summertime, but before it got too hot, and try to get the plants growing in the greenhouse at certain times a year, so we could get it out at the right time.
Thank you.
Great question, Amber. Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Karen. She says, is there a good resource for learning how to grow various Florida native species from seed? Very good question.
That's a good question, and I offhand do not know of those resources. Andy, do you mind chiming in here if you are better informed than I am?
Well, there is a newer book. I don't have the book in front of me, but it is by Stacy Matrazo from the Florida Wildflower Foundation. It's, I think, Native Plants for Florida Gardens is the name of the book. It has a pretty purple cover. I remember that. For each of the native plant profiles in that book, they do have gardening tips and propagation tips. So sometimes for propagation, they might give some information about growing the plants from seed, or maybe notes on if you started off buying a full grown plant, if it's likely to self-seed for you. And I know the question was about learning how to grow the natives from seed. There is one good seed source for native wildflowers, and that is the Florida Wildflower Growers Cooperative. You can find them online, and they have a whole selection of native wildflower seed packets that you can purchase and have shipped to you. We have a couple of more thank yous and excellent presentations for you, Wade. That's coming from Christy and another Beth. Do we have any more questions for Wade at this time? If a question comes to you later, please feel free to email us at naplesnativeplants@fnps.org, and we'll do our best to follow up with you with an answer. And I'd like to remind everybody that within a few days, a recording of this meeting and presentation will be on our website and YouTube channel, so look out for that. And another reminder that our next meeting is just 2 weeks from now, a little over since it's Monday. Forgot it was Monday. But on Wednesday, December 2nd at 6:30 will be our next online meeting. Well, thank you very much, Wade, for a great presentation. And thank you, everybody, for choosing to join us live in the meeting tonight. That means a lot to us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great evening. I'll go ahead and end the meeting now.